What does a queer future look like? When we think of how societies are built, we often reflect back upon what was established before us, the foundations of our cultures and communities. But what happens when we are positioned to establish the values and ideals of a society yet to develop? Ireland is a country well positioned to begin devising such plans. In part one of this two-parter, Building a Queer Island, we learned much of how LGBTQ+ rights were forged in the face of great resistance. Now, as we stand on the foundations of that social change, we must ask the question, what changes going forward? What is left to build for a queer island? Welcome to episode 17 of /Queer. You're here with me, your host, Georgie Williams. In this episode, we return to our conversation with infamous Irish queer rights activist Tonie Walsh, who, in the previous episode, spoke to us about the beginnings of the queer and gay liberation movements in Ireland, his involvement with the organisations behind the movements, and the long-standing fight for the rights and recognitions available to Irish queers today. If you haven't already, we at /Queer would strongly encourage you to take a listen to the previous episode before continuing here. The queer history of Ireland is complex and is by no means linear. Today, we explore issues of rural queerness, ageing queers, the importance of maintaining access to a queer history, and pathways for the advancement of LGBTQ+ politics in Ireland. We begin where we left off, with Tonie and his discussion of what queer community means and what it might look like moving forward.
There's a question you asked about notions of community, and I'm struck by how too often we treat the LGBT community, and it's a term I hate, as some sort of monolithic construct. And I think actually we've shaped a monolithic construct because it actually suits sort of certain types of intellectual arguments and posturing, cultural posturing and social posturing. But of course, you and I know that there's actually no such thing as an LGBT community. There are several communities within what I'd like to sort of notionally imagine as a rainbow society, you know, and sometimes we even have competing interests as well, you know, and oppositional interests, whether it's, you know, I'm thinking of, say, commercial prides. I went up to Derry Strabane Pride there. It's called Foyle Pride a couple of years ago, and it's the only Pride festival on the island of Ireland that continues to be non-commercial, and they take their non-commercial constitution very seriously. But it was really interesting to sort of like, it's really interesting just to see how, I've forgotten what I want to say there. Scratch it.
Well, I think what you were potentially referring to was the question where I was saying, you know, are there any misconceptions about LGBT and queer culture in Ireland that you wish to dispel, and how does it differentiate to kind of the culture and communities in other parts of the West? I'll
tell you how there's actually the first significant difference that I think that I see is that we don't have a commercial scene of the order magnitude of many other urban cultures. I mean, I'm thinking of all the large urban centres. You know, you can take this as a given the world over that LGBT people, indeed all marginalised people, tend to gravitate towards large urban centres because that's where social infrastructure is usually it's better embedded, and the choice is available for people. So people tend to gravitate. I don't necessarily think that's always a good thing because, you know, we strip small towns and villages we strip them of something essential and necessary. That queer worldview, that queer humanity, you know, can just be stripped of a small village if we don't find ways if we don't find ways for LGBT people to lead meaningful lives in places that they choose. And I'll give you an example. Like, I was born in Dublin, and as a child, I moved down to Clonmel, County Tipperary, a small town in the gravitational pull of Waterford and Limerick, beautiful countryside, Munster. And I grew up in Clonmel. And then once I did my leaving cert, I hightailed it back to Dublin to do university and lost my head and my heart to activism. And then many, many years later, in my 40s, moved back down to Clonmel to be a full-time carer to my mother. And when I moved back down in 2007, so I would have been 47 or something, yeah? And I'd actually just become HIV positive as well. It was a weird situation. But I found myself as a middle-aged gay man in this small town. And, Clonmel, one of the fatal presumptions that many Dubliners make, and especially the lazy media, is that, urban life ends at the M50. And of course it doesn't. I mean, most of Irish life is actually distinctly urban in every single way. Culturally, physically, it's urban. Clonmel is 19,000 people. It's surrounded by a hinterland of 60,000 people. Its culture is distinctly urban. It's not provincial. It's just a smaller version of Dublin. It has its Marks and Sparks and its TK Maxx and its bad planning, suburban planning, not unlike Dublin, Belfast and Cork. It has social alienation. It has not enough opportunities for teenagers. It's got major drug consumption that's the result of boredom. It's got all the myriad problems that are part and parcel of urban life, except on a smaller scale. But I'm saying that because in the 10 years that I was down there, I found myself really lonely because I don't use dating apps or anything like that. I never have. And I found myself really lonely, and it was, once you get over not having sex, which I did for a couple of years, I mean, that was actually became quite easy. What I really, really missed was intimacy. And that got me thinking about how we frame intimacy and the structures we need to put in place for people of various cultural sensibilities and age backgrounds. The systems we need to put in place for people to avail of intimacy. And that led me down some thoughts, a track about, growing older as a gay man, as a trans man or woman, as a lesbian, growing older in a place like Clonmel. And actually you could extend this to sort of heterosexual men and women for whom heteronormativity was never a choice. Heterosexual men and women who also just decided not to get married or not to have children or not to have their life simply validated through the relationships they had or the children they had or had not. So it got me thinking. I feel I'm rambling a little bit here, but what I'm trying to say is that, like, I thought long and hard about the things we need to do and how necessary it is for us right now to have conversations around what it takes for people to lead meaningful lives, meaningful social lives, meaningful cultural lives in towns and villages of their choices. I think that's one of the big issues facing the LGBT community as we have an aging demographic. We have to talk about that.
There is a brilliant concept within queer theory which articulates much of what Tonie is describing here. In Jack Halberstam's 2005 book, In a Queer Time and Place, Halberstam introduces the term metronormativity. Metronormativity, for Halberstam, is the normalization of the urban centre as a space of progression, visibility, and liberation for queer people. For the urban to be progressive and liberal, the rural must be backward and conservative. What then, as scholars of queer rurality, as it's called, have asked, happens to rural queers? What possible lives might LGBTQ+ individuals live if they do not want to live in urban cities? For some, this potentially erases the validity of rural queerness as a meaningful way of living. While the concept of metronormativity is decidedly USA-focused in its context, Tonie's articulation of Irish queerness bears similarity to this concept. What ideas of queerness become normalised as we push for political and cultural shifts? And who else's queerness do we erase as we do so? It would seem that to be gender and sexuality diverse in Ireland is to navigate a complex geopolitical landscape. Furthermore, an ageing queer population, particularly those in the so-called rural geographies, may indeed be expected to compromise on their beliefs. There is a deficit of caregivers for the elderly across much of Europe. The priority at this time is training said caregivers on the bare essentials to fill that deficit. Undeniably, many professional carers will be ill-equipped to understand the social and emotional needs of queer elders, whose kinship structures and complex life experiences may necessitate different forms of support and empathy. How do we as a community grow old in supportive spaces with our values and practices preserved if we are queer?
And we have to frame it in the context of the hard battles we fought, the choices we made. Because why the hell should we give it up? Why should we settle for less just because we've reached 55 or 65 or whatever? You know, I want to grow older, and you know, I'm 60, but inside I still feel 25. That's the bloody horrible paradox of getting older. It's not the dying, it's the decrepitude, but it's also, you know, I just think inside somewhere, the choices I made at 25 are still valid, you know? They're still valid for me in terms of the way I want to socialize, the value system that I not only fought long and hard for, but spent a long time looking for. These are things that I would like to think will envelop me and cocoon me as I slide into my 60s and 70s, you know? And it's a big question we need to be having. I was amazed that about 5 years ago, GCN did a significant article on aging called Golden Queers, and they put one of my darling friends, and an actually former tutor of mine, Bronya Smith, on the front cover. And I thought, okay, bravo, we're finally having these conversations, you know, about aging. It's really, really important. Really important. I do think one of the things that marks out the LGBT community in Ireland from other communities abroad is a profound sense of community that we have. I think there is, and the structures are there. We built those structures ourselves because we actually didn't get that much help. We didn't get that much help, certainly in the early days. You know, you look at something like Belong To, the youth group, and now they get funding from the Department of Family and Children. They get funding from the Department of Justice and whatever, may possibly social protection, whatever. That never happened in the 80s or even into the early 90s. So I think it's really exciting that stuff like that's happening.
Wow. Yeah, I think those provisions are something that's been overlooked for the longest time. And going back to what you said about aging queers as well, I think because of the impact of the AIDS crisis, it's really a subject that's only coming to a head now because of the people that did survive and who kind of paved the way for our communities, and now are in a position where never before have we really had to talk about, well, what does it look like, you know, as you get older as a queer person, you know, what accommodations need to be made. I think about how we do still see, like, beyond a certain age, we still assume cis heteronormativity of a particular generation. And I sometimes worry about the erasure of that queer community.
Well, I mean, you know as well as I do that one of the unique qualities of our rainbow society, the LGBT community, is that of all of the subcultures that we know of, we are the only one that does not have heredity in the sense that we know it. There aren't the parent-child links that are the convention of all other subcultural groups. So, and that's also one of the reasons, acknowledging that is actually one of the things that drives my abiding sense of historicity, my abiding sense of wanting to preserve our past and celebrate our history and celebrate and try and define some of the intergenerational and metagenerational links that have been established. It's really important. It's important in terms of passing on stories of struggles past. It's also important in terms of passing on and sharing the wonder of how we framed our relationships and our friendships. They're the building blocks of community. They're really important. We should never take them for granted. It's sometimes it's good. I don't want to go and beat people over the head about how bloody brutal it was back in the 70s or 80s and whatever else, because actually I survived and I'm here right now, and it's now we need to talk about. The future is now. Now we need to talk about it. But it is really important to, I think, every now and then to have a moment to take stock of the distance we've traveled and go, wow, what got us here? Who got us here? And I think, to me, that's the abiding value, for example, of Pride every year. Pride's the ideal time for us to have that sort of metaphysical moment and even to have a conversation about it as well and to acknowledge the journey, to acknowledge. And I think too, in Ireland, we have been, and I don't want to, I'm aware that I've been part of this dynamic, but I need to say that the LGBT community has been really well served by its leaders. We've been very lucky at the people we've inherited, and people who have given us certain things, who've not only signposted the journey for us, but who have emboldened us along the way. There are many, many, many extraordinary people. And I suppose it's not only now in the distance of time that we're actually taking moments. And also because of the proliferation of queer studies and queer history studies and everything else, which of course you are very much an important part of. But it's only as a result of this recent developments that I think we've become a lot more mindful and aware of the roles that various people have played and the decisions that people have made to sort of get us to this place. We're also very lucky in Ireland too, and I'm wearing my Irish Queer Archive hat now. We're really lucky that we have what I call the foundational documents of the Irish, almost all of the foundational documents of the Irish LGBT civil rights movement, either in the Irish Queer Archive or the Cork Archive, or else in the burgeoning trans archive that my dear friend Sarah Phillips is developing. So we have all of these foundational documents which are really, really important. And it means we have access to the thought processes and the choices and the dreams of our founding brothers and sisters. And that's really important. It's really inspiring as well, actually. So also, I think it's really handy too, because it means that we don't have to make it up as we go along. It's not about always reinventing the wheel. We can actually look back. We can look back at, how people have done stuff in the past and then decide, you know what, I'm going to take that, but I'm just going to do it even better. I've always said this, I've gone on record many times as saying that I think the part of the legacy of the AIDS pandemic is the manner in which we found ways to survive the brutality of the period. The coping mechanisms and survival strategies of the period were really important to us. I mentioned the Irish Queer Archive, and I should correct a common misconception that I founded the Irish Queer Archive. And actually, what I did was simply arrive in Outhouse in Dublin in a little bit around this time in 1997. And I walked into a room that was just full of black plastic bags. The National LGBT Federation moved into new offices in what would be the first iteration of Outhouse on South William Street, over a fabulous Indian restaurant, if my memory serves me right. And anyway, there was just all of this documentation. And I turned around to Michael McGrain and the editor of GCN at the time, Deborah Ballard, and said, let me do something with this. And they took me on as a part-time employee, and then I got motivated some other people and then ponied up some cash. And not long afterwards, a couple of years later, put a name on it. So what I really did was I took earlier collections from groups like the Sexual Liberation Movement, which was founded in Trinity in 73, took also the documents from the Irish Gay Rights Movement, which was founded in 1974, took the National Gay Federation's documents, then also acquired the administrative records of groups like LOT, Lesbians Organising Together, myriad a number of other different groups, publishing groups, and essentially put some form in it and gave it a name as well, because I didn't like it was originally called the National Lesbian Gay Archive, and that just didn't really describe the breadth and width of the collection. Certainly didn't describe the richness and variety of the collection. You know, earlier on you were talking about gender and sexuality, and you know they're two sides of the same coin. We can't have a conversation about one without actually embracing the other. And it's not for nothing that, you know, historically the feminized gay men have been the target of bullying and harassment by uber straight guys. It's because, of course, you know, the cultural misogyny that has existed since time immemorial, and we simply can't have the idea that a man could actually allow himself to be feminized and be seen as weak or less, simply just doesn't ride. But anyway, I'm digressing. But back to the Irish Queer Archive. So yeah, it was about putting some form on it and then being an advocate for it, and essentially doing what I'm best doing, which is being mouthy. trying to persuade people to actually give it cash and make it fly. I always had a vision for a self-standing independent archive, but not unlike, say, the Lesbian History Archive in New York, which I've always been a huge admirer of. And I think there's a lot to be said for us shaping and controlling our own history. LGBT people shaping and controlling our own history.
The Lesbian History Archives, as Tonie mentions, are a foundational collection of lesbian and women's organisations, activism, and politics in New York, created at the beginning of the 1970s. The archives, now located in their permanent home on the Upper West Side in the apartment that once belonged to one of their founders, Joan Nessel, were created by a group of women within the Gay Academic Union, who realised that lesbian history was, and I quote, disappearing as quickly as it was being made. The archives, still open today and free to visit and use, are an example of community-centred, owned and managed projects that run throughout political organising. They are a testament to the long and rich history of lesbian politics, and a bastion of standing firm in the face of endangering forces. The Irish Queer Archives that Tonie helped to found, as he mentions, were very much inspired by the Lesbian History Archives. Such projects demonstrate the tenacity and dexterity of queer activism and politics, and are vital records of our shared, collective and individual histories. They are pivotal in maintaining access to a history that might otherwise be forgotten or erased, and are consequently massively important to contemporary queer organising and community. The foundations of Queer Ireland are very much preserved in and by these archives.
But you know what? The Irish Queer Archive is in the National Library of Ireland, and it's in a state repository, and I think that's a really brilliant thing. The symbolism is enormous in terms of what it says about Irish society, and statutory Ireland not only taking ownership of our history, but valuing it and being seen to do something important with it, and acknowledging that this is a repository that is worth sharing with the rest of Ireland. That we can't, to paraphrase the great Colm Tobin, that you can't write a history of modern Ireland without accessing and acknowledging everything that's in the Irish Queer Archive. But, talking about ownership and everything brings me back to one of the reasons why I set up GCN. Apart from the fact that I wanted a job as a jobbing journalist, and I've been working as a staff reporter on Out Magazine, which was Ireland's first commercial magazine, and it had floundered. There was a massive number of problems. Printers refused to print it. I mean, you're probably familiar with all of these stories. The Carlow and Leinster Times, I'll just briefly recap for anyone who doesn't know this, but it had an uphill struggle. It ran for 4 years. It had an uphill struggle as Ireland's first glossy commercial consumer title. It had an uphill struggle trying to get advertising in an economically and socially hostile environment. It had some great writers, great opinions. It was a fabulous platform. Now McCafferty was a regular contributor. It did some amazing work in documenting the unfolding AIDS pandemic, amongst other things. But it was always undercapitalized, and it operated on a shoestring. So all it needed was just one small problem to just tip it over. And that happened with the penultimate issue, where the Carlow and Leinster Times took an exception to a fairly innocuous safer sex ad, a fucking safer sex ad. When you think about it now, it's so ridiculous. And they refused to print it. Because this is in the context of male homosexuality being illegal. They took exception to a safer sex ad and refused to print it, and the thing just collapsed. And I was out of a job, and I was really incensed. I was 26, 27, I was out of a job, and I thought I had a great writing career ahead of me. So I wanted the platform, so selfishly, I wanted the platform to be published. But the thing, as an activist, the thing that really, really riled me was that the state was actively censoring our access as a community, was censoring our access to information. It had twice tried to ban gay news, which was published in the London School of Economics in 1973. It's now called Gay Times. It's been morphed into Gay Times in the mid-'80s. But gay news was and remains Europe's largest, most successful English language newspaper. Fabulous A3 newspaper. And the government twice tried to ban it, citing the old Victorian legislation, which was basically a cop-out, claiming that it was indecent and obscene, whatever. But they banned it in the late 70s, and they tried to ban it in 1982, but we were opposed to ban in 1982, and we were a lot better organized. But so, I'm mentioning this because that's the type of climate we had. So setting up GCN was really important in terms of developing a platform where our voices were heard and our voices mattered, because you know what? The mainstream media didn't give a toss about it. And the mainstream media has been long in coming to a place where it actually freely accommodates our stories. And even today, there are LGBT people working in every branch of the print and broadcast media in good and bad ways. Some people are limited and some people have extraordinary freedoms. Our stories get out there, frankly. They get out there now. We see ourselves represented in pop culture and everything else. We have anchor men and women who are LGBT, whatever, running magazine programs, news shows and everything else. It's so much different from what it was 10 years ago, 20 years ago, definitely 30 years ago. But you know what? I think there's still a need for us to define our own narrative. There's a need for us to actually parse the stories of our struggle and to ensure that they're preserved. And this comes down to, and we can even see it, the way this playing out, the fraught nature of conversations around gender identity, especially in countries close to us like England. I think one of the interesting things in Ireland is that it seems to me that the Irish feminists had a conversation amongst themselves about, or if they didn't have a conversation, they knew instinctively what the answer was to the question of how we embrace the concerns and needs of our trans brothers and sisters. With the results that actually it seems that the Irish women's liberation movement in all its guises is on board with the trans struggle in a way that is just not. It's utterly fractured and venomous and fraught in countries like the UK. But it seems that we've had much better accommodation, much greater sense. There's compassion and understanding seem to be more, as qualities seem to be more embedded and inform the conversations that we're having here. But I do think that there's always been an abiding need on the part of the LGBT community for us to frame our stories on our own terms. Really, 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 really important. Because you know what? History has shown us that we can't trust other people to do it for us, you know? And that's down to whether it's the language we use or the type of imagery that we choose to actually define our cultural choices. All of that's really important. And you know what? I'll be damned if I'm going to have arguments with some mainstream sub-editor of magazine and newspaper about what pictures should be allowed or what words and terms I should use if I'm writing a really important, like 3,000 word essay or whatever else, you know. I think it's really important to know that there's a choice there for us, that there are other platforms that we have. There are podcasts, there are broadcasts, there are queer channels on YouTube or whatever else. There's the whole panoply of broadcasting. And I think too also that increasingly diverse and noisy landscape of broadcasting is also really important because it's necessary for us to actually create a landscape of inclusivity, you know. We have to remember that is, you know, going back to the comment I made about the LGBT community not being this monolithic construct, that there's a multiplicity of voices. And if we're going to do ourselves any favor, and if we're going to ensure that we get to the promised land and we can enjoy it and bring as many people with us, then we need to develop the structures that will actually allow everybody into the conversation. That's really important because too often those, you know, voices have been locked out.
I 100% agree. And I think this is the direction that a lot of conversations are going in now, that it's not about finding a representative of this supposedly monolithic community to speak for all of us. You know, it's so much more about saying there should be a platform for individual experience so that we don't homogenize groups, so that we don't presume what experiences these individuals have had based on them fitting into a particular demographic, because that's ultimately what the intersectional perspective is about. It's about saying, it's not just about reducing us down to